Professor Ramesh Dixit, Professor Badri Narayan, friends, students, members of the faculty. It's a pleasure and an honor for me that I have been asked to come and deliver this lecture. It's my first visit to this institute. It's very difficult to give a lecture after an introduction of the sort which has been given to me by Professor Bhaskar Majumdar. It's also a pleasure for me to revisit Allahabad, where, as I was saying in the morning, I had first come at the age of 19 as part of a debating team, two of us from my college in Delhi. Allahabad used to be famous for its debating culture. Amarnath Jha Hostel debate was quite well known, and of course made friends at that time who have remained my friends all through my life. Therefore, I always enjoy coming here, and I'm really grateful that this opportunity has been given to me. In this, talking about the concept of development, let me begin by talking about two presumptions which all of us generally have when we talk about development. The first is that development must consist in shifting the workforce from traditional low productivity sectors to sectors which are modern, which have high productivity. Typically, this means shifting people from what you may say the sector of petty production, craftsmen, peasant agriculturists, landless laborers, fishermen, and so on, to the modern sector, which is typically a capitalist sector. So development is generally seen in terms of a shift of the workforce from low productivity to high productivity sectors, and that typically also means from petty production sectors to modern capitalist sectors. The second presumption is that if the modern capitalist sector is allowed freedom to accumulate, in that case, barring occasional crisis, which let us assume away, it would accumulate, it would grow rapidly, and it would really absorb people from this traditional petty production sector. Therefore, what you require for development is really a rapidly growing capitalist sector. If, and from this a corollary is drawn, that even if the rapidly growing capitalist sector encroaches upon and destroys segments of the pre-capitalist sector, doesn't matter, because this very rapid growth would ultimately absorb everybody from the traditional sector anyway. And this is something which is defended first with reference to the experience of Western European capitalism. As you know, at the beginning of Western European capitalism, there was a massive destruction of peasant agriculture through the enclosure movement, which Marx referred to as a process of primitive accumulation of capital. But those who were displaced, enclosure movement basically meant private encroachment upon communal land, which made the lives of those who depended upon the communal land impossible to sustain, and therefore they lost their livelihoods. They migrated to the cities in search of jobs. They constituted the modern proletariat, but of course they were absorbed into the capitalist sector, so it doesn't matter. That's the kind of history which we are going to repeat in our country, that even if the fisherman sector is destroyed, traditional fisherman sector, even if traditional craftsman sector is destroyed, even if peasant agriculture is destroyed with the peasantry losing its livelihood and agriculture becoming increasingly capitalist, it doesn't matter, because all these people would also get absorbed, as has been the case in Western Europe. Now, this is also defended theoretically in terms of a model which would be familiar to all economic students, the Lewis model. The Lewis model talks about the fact that there is a traditional sector. In the traditional sector, labor productivity is very low because large numbers of people are really crowded into it. If labor productivity is low there, that means per capita incomes are low. In that case, in the modern sector, the wage rate remains close to a subsistence level. But in the modern sector, productivity is high, labor productivity is high. Therefore, surplus is high. And therefore, if this surplus is invested, scope for accumulation is provided, then the sector will grow very rapidly and over a period of time begin to absorb everybody from the traditional sector, which, as I said, in terms of property relations, would be a traditional pre-capitalist sector. So economic theory tells us, or development theory tells us, that basically the whole idea of development is to give scope, to create scope for the capitalist sector to accumulate rapidly, and also historical experience appears to suggest that this is something which would ultimately absorb everybody from the traditional sectors, and even if the traditional sectors are destroyed, makes no difference, ultimately they're all going to be absorbed. That capitalism has this tendency that even if it destroys pre-capitalist production, nonetheless it reabsorbs them over a period of time at much higher levels of wages. So development is a process of shifting workers from the traditional to the modern, by which I mean from the pre-capitalist to the capitalist sector. And for this, all that is required is that the process of capital accumulation in the capitalist sector must not be impeded. It must be encouraged in every possible way. And this is basically what, when Narendra Modi talks about Vikas and so on, this is basically what they mean. That, it doesn't matter if we facilitate lives for the Ambanis and the Adanis and so on, they accumulate, the sector grows rapidly, and so ultimately poverty will disappear. Now, I think both the theoretical and the historical interpretations or perceptions on which this understanding is based are seriously flawed. And that's what I want to talk about. The historical perception, the theoretical perception is seriously flawed because most of you, I imagine the economic students at any rate, would be familiar with the Lewis model. The Lewis model is based on the assumption that the modern sector, the capitalist sector, has a level of labor productivity that is high, but there is no technological progress taking place. It is a one-shot affair. It is a one-shot transition from a low productivity to a high labor productivity sector. But if you have continuous technological progress, then it follows that the capacity of that sector to absorb labor for any given growth rate of output would keep declining over time. It is an arithmetical truism that the rate of growth of employment in the capitalist sector is simply the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity. If output grows at 10%, labor productivity grows at 6%, employment must grow at 4%. If labor productivity grows at 9% and output grows at 11%, then employment must grow at 2%. This is just a standard arithmetical truism. So if you have a situation where at any given growth rate, labor productivity keeps increasing because you have continuous technological progress, in that case the capacity of the sector to absorb larger and larger numbers of workers will decline because the rate of growth of employment will then decline. If the rate of growth of employment is low, the rate of growth of the natural workforce, or the natural rate of growth of the workforce, in that case, let alone absorbing people from the traditional pre-capitalist sector, the capitalist sector would not even be able to absorb the natural growth rate of the workforce that is occurring within itself. Consequently, it follows that the theoretical justification which is provided by the Lewis model that you basically simply allow the capitalist sector the scope to accumulate, and automatically you would have an absorption of labor reserves, an absorption of labor from the pre-capitalist sector, so that ultimately poverty and so on would disappear, low productivity sectors would disappear, and since poverty is linked to the existence of low productivity sectors, poverty would disappear. Because once those sectors have disappeared, then there would be a tightness in the labor market. When there is a tightness in the labor market, real wages would rise, and when real wages rise, naturally, the condition of the working people improves, poverty disappears. Now that entire assumption, even leaving aside any question of economic crisis, problems of accumulation, whether the capital sector accumulates or not, let's leave aside all that. Even assuming that the capitalist sector actually accumulates, no crisis, nothing. Even then, if you have an increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity, then the rate of growth of employment would actually slow down. Looking at it differently, I just want to reiterate the arithmetical truism that the rate of growth of employment is simply the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity. If this difference happens to be less than the rate of growth of the workforce, then you would have labor reserves increasing rather than decreasing, poverty increasing rather than decreasing. I shall come back to this question in a moment. The historical evidence which is used for buttressing this argument is equally absurd. It is absurd because in Western Europe, the fact that the enormous amount of unemployment and labor reserves that were created through the process of primitive accumulation of capital was absorbed in the capitalist sector is not actually correct. A tightness in the labor market was produced because of massive emigration of workers from Western Europe to the temperate regions of European settlement like Canada, United States, Australia, South Africa, and such like. Again, Arthur Lewis has estimated, this morning I was looking at the museum here, Arthur Lewis talks about the fact that during the 19th century, the long 19th century, right up to the First World War, there were two massive streams of migration in the world, and these streams were kept strictly separate. One was a low-wage migration which occurred from tropics to tropics, and that's the kind of migration which is captured in the museum, for instance. Indian and Chinese labor, coolie labor from China, indentured labor from India, went to other tropical or subtropical places, like for instance Kenya, East Africa, Caribbean, West Indies and so on, Fiji, Mauritius, in order to work on plantations after the formal end of slavery. But that was a low-wage labor. It was not allowed to go to the temperate regions. Even to this day, there are massive restrictions upon Indian or tropical immigration to the temperate regions. You can't just go and settle down in Australia or settle down in New Zealand or whatever. But on the other hand, there was a temperate to temperate migration, which was high-wage migration. And that was European migration, which, as I said, went to America, to Canada, to New Zealand, Australia, etc. Arthur Lewis's explanation why it was high-wage migration is a wrong explanation. His explanation, which many of you will be familiar with, is that in Europe there had been an agricultural revolution. Because there had been an agricultural revolution, productivity had increased per acre as well as per worker had increased dramatically, and therefore the amount of wheat, let us say, which a peasant produced on an acre of land in England was almost 3 times the amount of wheat that a peasant produces on an acre of land in India. That being the case, you already had a difference in incomes, and therefore one was a high-wage migration, the other was a low-wage migration. That's completely wrong, because even if we accept the figures of differential productivities, the fact remains that in India, typically there were 3 crops grown in a season, while in England there was only 1 crop grown during the season. In the winter months you can't grow anything. And as a result, when you look at the income of an Indian peasant owning or cultivating an acre of land over the year as a whole, and compare it to the income of an English peasant cultivating an identical land over the year as a whole, the Indian peasant's income was no less than that of the English peasant. If anything, it was more. And the same is true of the Chinese peasant, the Vietnamese peasant, the Indonesian peasant, the Malaysian peasant, and so on. So in the tropics, it was possible to have multiple cropping, which is why incomes per person, per unit of land, were no less. And consequently, this explanation doesn't really explain why, this explanation is inadequate to understand why you had a high wage migration from temperate to temperate regions. You had a high wage migration because of the fact that the emigres from Europe got rid of the local population in the United States, Canada, and wherever they went, got hold of huge amounts of land, and consequently set themselves up as farmers with much higher levels of income. And as a result, their home wages also went up, because if you could migrate and obtain high levels of income, then who would stay at a wage that was a pittance? As a result, you actually had that kind of migration pulling up wages rather than high wages ensuring that migration occurred at that wage. On the other hand, in the tropics, because of the process of colonial deindustrialization, you had actually an enormous growth of labor reserves. Again, if you just go to the museum, it says how the migration to Suriname was because of the fact, from the local area, was because of the fact that you actually had substantial reductions in wage rate and so on, following upon the decline of traditional crafts because of colonial deindustrialization. So you had these 2 streams of migration. The reason why in Europe you actually had a tightness being introduced in the labor market was not because capitalism automatically produces the tightness because of high rates of accumulation, but because you had large emigration that actually took place. Lewis calculates that in the long 19th century, I use the term which Hobsbawm had used to refer to the 19th century stretching up to the First World War. In the long 19th century, about 50 million Indian and Chinese workers migrated to the tropical and subtropical regions, and he also calculates about an identical number. 50 million European workers migrated to the temperate regions of settlement. Now, if you look at the population of Europe at that time, this 50 million was an enormous number that occurred over this period. If you look at England in particular, then you find that the total migration from England between the end of Napoleonic Wars to 1910 was about 15 million, while England's population at the base date was about 12 million. If you make a similar calculation, then you would find that migration on that scale from India should have meant that at least 40 crore Indians since independence should have migrated out. That's the kind of scale. Now obviously with that scale of migration, you find that really the unemployment generated by the destruction of petty production, by the implosion movement, by primitive accumulation of capital was taken care of. Now that possibility is obviously not available to us. While at the same time, the kind of theoretical understanding that you get from Lewis' model and so on, which precludes technological progress, is something which is erroneous, and consequently whether capitalism would absorb all the people currently engaged in the pre-capitalist sector, when the pre-capitalist sector has been further overcrowded by the fact of colonial deindustrialization, remains an open question. Now, there is another factor which I want to bring to your notice, and that is the following. That suppose, just assume for a moment that we have a growth rate, and suppose assume in the capitalist sector, and assume for a moment that this growth rate in the capitalist sector, let's say 8%, is accompanied by 7% growth rate in labor productivity, so that you have a 1% growth rate in employment, and let's assume that the rate of growth of the workforce is 1.5%, which basically means that the capitalist sector, far from absorbing anybody from the pre-capitalist sector, cannot even provide employment to the workforce growth that is occurring within itself. Let's just assume that for a moment. Suppose this happens, then because of the existence of vast numbers of labor reserves, the real wages in the capitalist sector will more or less remain at a subsistence level. They cannot rise because you actually have vast amounts of labor reserves. But at the same time, labor productivity, by my assumption, remember, is growing at 7%. So if labor productivity is growing at 7% while wages are not rising, that means the surplus is rising. The proportion of surplus in output is rising. Now let us assume that this creates no problems of demand. There are, as you know, major theories in economics which have been advanced that a shift from wages to profit gives rise to deficiency in aggregate demand, causing crisis and so on. Let's assume them away. Let's assume that there is no problem of demand. Let's assume that this entire surplus is realized, that there is enough demand to make sure that the surplus is produced and realized. Now, typically, the surplus earners have a consumption pattern that is much less employment intensive than the wage earners. The working people generally consume things which are much more employment intensive than the well-to-do people. The well-to-do people, to start with, as I said, may not actually spend. They may say we're going to spend day after tomorrow and therefore keep the money in their pockets. And even if they do spend, they may spend it on, let's say, going for a holiday in the French Riviera, which generates no employment here. They may spend it on buying some goods which require very little employment, highly capital intensive, not very labor intensive commodities. The working people, on the other hand, typically demand goods which are much more employment intensive. When I used to be in Kerala as the deputy chairman of the planning board there, I would often go around to visit FGNREGS sites, that is the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme sites. And I would ask the people working on those sites how they spent the wages they got. And typically the answer would be that, they went and bought that stone grinder with which dosa paste is made. Now that stone grinder is available in the neighboring village and highly employment intensive. And as a result, much of their consumption pattern is highly employment intensive. Any change in income distribution from wages to surplus implies that per unit of output, less employment is generated. Therefore, it implies that to produce a unit of output, labor productivity is higher. And if you have continuous change taking place, because as I said, labor reserves are there, real wages don't rise, productivity keeps rising, which means there's a continuous change taking place from wages to surplus, then the rate of growth of labor productivity for any given rate of growth of output keeps increasing. And when it keeps increasing, the capacity to generate employment keeps decreasing. So we started with an assumption that let us assume labour reserves are not used up, and we end up with the conclusion that if the labour reserves are not used up to start with, they would never get used up over time because of the fact that actually the employment generation capacity would keep falling and falling and falling. And that's what we mean by jobless growth, that over a period of time then the capacity of the growth process to generate jobs keeps declining. When this happens, what you find therefore is that the capitalist sector is really not absorbing anybody from the pre-capitalist sector. It's not even absorbing the natural labor force growth that is occurring within itself. Additionally, when the capitalist sector also encroaches on the pre-capitalist sector, for instance, when you have, let's say, Walmart replacing retail trade, thousands of billions of retail traders, when you have all kinds of modern gadgetry replacing old kind of traditional crafts or traditional producers, the capitalist sector is encroaching on the pre-capitalist sector. When you have golf courses taking away land from the peasants, when you have so-called infrastructure projects, which are often camouflage real estate projects, taking over land from peasant agriculture, then you find that the capitalist sector is encroaching on the pre-capitalist sector. So the capitalist sector not only does not generate adequate employment, let alone to absorb the workers from the pre-capitalist sector, it doesn't even generate enough employment to absorb workers which are naturally growing within itself, but additionally it is also playing the role of destroying the pre-capitalist sector in all these different ways. That growth, even if numerically very impressive, is accompanied by increasing poverty. Therefore, the idea of growth at one end producing growing poverty at another is something that gets refurbished in this particular situation. The contrast here from the traditional understanding is very clear. The traditional understanding said that capitalist growth destroys poverty because it sucks people away from the pre-capitalist sector. It actually sucks them away at the existing real wages, which, even if they are equal to the per capita output in the pre-capitalist sector, would over a period of time increase. Here what you find is just the opposite taking place. It creates destruction of jobs in the pre-capitalist sector and not even adequate creation of jobs within the capitalist sector to take care of its own rate of natural growth of workforce, the natural rate of growth of workforce in the pre-capitalist sector, and those who have lost their jobs because of the encroachment in the capitalist sector. So when you look at this enormous mass of job seekers, the amount of jobs created is minuscule relative to this, and therefore you have a situation where there is a growing poverty, growing absolute poverty that accompanies this growth process. And therefore this is the production of growth at one pole resulting in the production of poverty at another. And this cannot by any stretch of imagination be considered development. Therefore, our conception of development is based, as I said, on the presumption that a high rate of GDP growth would actually, mind you, we are not even talking about capitalist and pre-capitalist sectors, we are talking about GDP growth, which is even worse, because you see, I was talking about the capitalist sector and the pre-capitalist sector, the growth in the capitalist sector. Even if we assume that there is genuine growth taking both sectors together, and what do we mean by genuine growth? That the bundle of goods produced increases in absolute terms. Every element in the bundle increases, there is no reduction, there is no diminishing in any element of the bundle, which economists refer to as a vector-wise increase in the bundle. Even if growth is defined as a vector-wise increase in the bundle taking place in the economy as a whole, taking both sectors together, there is no reason why this itself can actually not be accompanied by growing unemployment, growing labor reserves and growing poverty. But what is more, GDP growth does not mean a vector-wise increase in the bundle of goods. What does GDP mean? GDP basically means that at any given base prices, we have a bundle of goods in the base year, we have a bundle of goods in the final year, we take the total value of the bundle of goods in the base year at base prices, we take the total value of the bundle of goods in the final year at base prices, and if the value in the final year is larger, we say GDP has grown. But that's not the same as a vector-wise increase where every element in the bundle has increased. I think the economic students here would certainly be very familiar with this, that when you say there's a vector-wise increase in bundle, that basically implies that at every possible price, the final year goods would have a higher value than the base year goods at every possible price. GDP is talking about only at the base price, not at every possible price. So GDP growth is perfectly compatible with the fact that some commodities output goes down, other commodities output goes up, and nonetheless we say there is GDP growth. I'm saying that even if there is an increase in the output of every commodity, nonetheless you can have growing poverty for reasons I've been talking about, if it is the case that actually labor productivity increases to a point where ability to provide employment falls short of the requirements of employment. But on the other hand, with GDP growth rate, obviously there is absolutely no reason why what I'm saying should not happen. Therefore, this whole idea that development consists in GDP growth, even if it's per capita GDP growth, certainly makes absolutely no sense. On the contrary, in countries in which the capacity of the growth process to absorb labor, because of the high rate of growth of labor productivity, is limited, you find that this capacity decreases over time because income distribution shifts in favor of profits and surplus, surplus implying also middle class incomes who are, as it were, hangers-on the capitalists, and as a result we find that actually poverty continues to increase. This is the scenario which has been working itself out in an economy like ours. Now there is so much, firstly this is so little understood that you often come across, for instance, leaders, big political leaders, president, prime minister, and not only with this regime, even earlier, saying that we must raise labor productivity. What is not realized is that the more we raise labor productivity, the less, for any given growth rate, is our capacity to generate employment. The more we raise labor productivity, the less we are in a position to absorb the labor reserves which exist in the country, which are kind of, in kind of very substantial proportion. I should clarify that the labor reserves exist in our country not as open unemployment. When you have labor reserves existing, typically employment rationing takes the form, not that some people are fully employed, other people are fully unemployed, but rather everybody is unemployed for a bit of time. It takes the form of casual employment, intermittent employment, disguised unemployment, etc. So that actually, and these, as you know, have increased dramatically. As a matter of fact, people who are employed in some sense in the organized sector with some degree of legal protection to their employment constitute about 4% of the total workforce in the country. As a result, we actually have a proliferation of labor reserves taking place, but that's not in the form of open unemployment. Now that actually also makes it very difficult to calculate what is employment growth. You must have seen in the newspapers a lot of debate about what's employment growth. During the Depression in Britain in the 1930s, a lot of people who were unemployed set themselves up as shoe-shine boys. They actually used to sit by the roadside and shine shoes, offer to shine shoes. You could say that they were unemployed, but you could say that no, there is enormous increase in employment in the shoe-shine sector. And as a result, for you to be able to say that there is an increase in unemployment or there is an increase in labour reserves, there must be some criterion, which is why Joe Robinson introduced the notion of disguised unemployment. The shoe-shine people are actually unemployed in disguise. Now, that's of course difficult. You can introduce the notion of disguised unemployment in various ways. You can take an income criterion saying anybody who gets an income above this over a certain period during a year, we call them employed. Anybody who does not, we call them unemployed. You can take alternative criteria. One criterion which is taken by the Indian National Sample Survey is to ask people the question, do you consider your usual status to be that of a person who is employed? And that's, as you know, called usual status employment. Let's take usual status employment as some kind of a proxy for authentic employment. You find that actually, say, over a 5-year NSS period during which there was a tremendous growth in output, 2004-05 and 2009-10. There was a very rapid increase in output. GDP grew at 7-8% per annum. During that period, usual status employment increased at 0.8% per annum. Now, population growth and therefore workforce growth is far in excess of this. It follows, therefore, that the capacity of the capitalist sector to absorb labour that was a result of the natural rate of growth of the workforce within itself was itself impaired, let alone taking workers from elsewhere, and at the same time you found that land was being taken over for all kinds of projects which basically created unemployment in the pre-capitalist or the traditional sector, in peasant agriculture, etc. Now, it follows therefore that in situations like ours, this understanding of development, this concept of development that you provide all kinds of facilities, create scope for capital accumulation to take place, and if there is a rapid rate of capital accumulation, then you will find that your poverty would automatically disappear, is something which is a false concept. And what is more, when it is argued it's a false concept, typically the argument which is put forward from the other side, Chidambaram for instance gave this argument, oh yes, of course, maybe that we are not able to absorb labour reserves now, but that only means that we actually ought to have still higher growth rate. But remember, a still higher growth rate would basically imply that not only would it create, other things being the same, larger demand for labour, it will also create larger number of job seekers, because this high growth rate would also impinge on pre-capitalist production. High growth rate would imply ease in taking over land from peasant agriculture. High growth rate would imply ease in displacing traditional retailing sector, ease in displacing traditional craftsmen and so on. So high growth rate would entail providing facilities to the capitalist sector, which would increase its capacity to encroach on the pre-capitalist sector and increase therefore the number of job seekers, even when, let us assume, it increases the number of people demanding jobs. And consequently, high growth rate is not a panacea, because there is no reason to believe that the additional labour supply that this creates for employment in the capitalist sector would be less than the labour demand it generates for higher employment in the capitalist sector. Now, if this is the case, then the question arises, then how do we actually visualize the process of development in countries like ours? I think there are at least three components which must be part of a development strategy in countries like ours. The first component is that there has to be protection of petty production. In other words, instead of a destruction of petty production as is happening, there's a crisis of agriculture, that all kinds of producers, peasant producers in Lucknow, they went and dumped their produce in front of the Chief Minister's house and so on. So we know that petty production sector is in a serious crisis. The first essential condition for development is in fact to defend and promote the petty production sector, by which I mean peasant agriculture, and I mean also all kinds of craftsmen, fishermen, traditional petty fishermen, craftsmen, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, their levels of productivity per person are very low, which is, after all, the cause of their poverty. Therefore, even while protecting that sector, it becomes important to increase the productivity of this sector, but an increase in productivity that does not give rise to unemployment. One way that, for instance, you can have such increases in productivity is through a cooperativization, voluntary collectivization of the petty production sector. If you have a voluntary collectivization of the petty production sector, for instance, a doubling of labor productivity would either mean a doubling of their incomes with output increasing, or a doubling of labor productivity would mean that even if their incomes as workers get halved, that is compensated by their incomes as property owners, because they themselves are, after all, owning this collective. And therefore, the first thing to do is protect and promote petty production and ensure that collective and cooperative forms of ownership are introduced in this sector, become as generalized as possible, so that we can actually bring about an improvement in labor productivity without worrying about its destroying people's incomes. The second thing is that there has to be a substantial land augmentation measure. I talk about petty production, but the most important element of petty production is, of course, peasant agriculture. Peasant agriculture implies that if you are going to have an increase in incomes of those dependent on agriculture, peasants, laborers, everybody, then it's very important. Not that labor productivity increases, because increase in labor productivity is not the crucial thing. Crucial is increase in land productivity. Increase in land productivity is what I call land augmenting measures. You have to have increases in land yields, and this is something which necessarily requires the support of the state. There's a very famous remark, by the way, this has always been the case in Asian conditions. There's a very famous remark of Marx which actually says that all Asian societies, and India above all, had three main departments. The Department of Revenue, which was an internal taxation of its people, internal kind of, sort of appropriation from its people, Department of War, which was external appropriation, and Department of Irrigation, because irrigation was extremely important for maintaining or increasing land productivity. This idea about the importance of irrigation, the necessity for the state to provide land augmentation measures, is something then taken over by a German author called Karl Wittfogel, who developed a theory of Oriental despotism, whose argument was that because in Oriental societies you need the state as an essential element for producing this kind of massive irrigation works and so on, it tends to become a despotic state, which of course is not correct, and his theory of Oriental despotism has been vastly, very sharply criticized, above all by Professor Irfan Habib in a well-known paper called A Critique of Wittfogel's Theory of Oriental Despotism. Anyhow, but the point is that land augmentation is crucial, which means yields have to rise, land yields have to rise through multiple cropping, through irrigation, through better practices all of which for which the state has to bear a responsibility. The third feature of any development strategy would be, surprising though it may seem, a control on the rate of technological cum structural change. Now this may appear to be surprising because, as I said, everybody seems to believe that it's very good that if you have high rates of labor productivity. As a matter of fact, perhaps the smartest, the cleverest Indian produced in the last 100 years, Gandhiji, understood this. He understood the fact that you cannot eliminate poverty in societies like ours unless you actually have some control on the rate of technological cum structural change. Likewise, when Chairman Mao in China was talking on backyard steel, he was actually talking about having some degree of control on technological cum structural change, because steel has to be produced, but not just in factories. You can actually have steel production within the petty production sector, which is talking about when he says backyard steel. Therefore, a constraint upon technological cum structural change is something which appears to be essential if we have to move towards absorbing labor reserves. Now, this is something which surprisingly actually occurred in the socialist countries, Soviet Union and elsewhere. I should say that these days, of course, those economies, that experience is much verified, but one aspect of that experience, which is extremely relevant for us, is that those were the only countries in modern world history that actually not only produced full employment, but were actually afflicted by labor shortage. One of the major critics of socialism coming from within the socialist world is the economist Janos Kornai, who, as you know, very, very respected Hungarian economist. Janos Kornai says that actually one of the achievements of that socialism is that it used up labor reserves. How did they use up labor reserves? They used up labor reserves, above all, by having some degrees of control over technological cum structural change. For instance, mines which were not making profits would not be closed down. Under capitalist conditions, such mines would be closed down, which means lots of miners would lose their jobs. But that was not the case. Therefore, you actually had a production structure that in some sense prevented high rates of technological cum structural change. Many people criticize, laugh at the Soviet Union or other socialist countries by saying, look at the kind of shoddy consumer goods they have compared to the lovely consumer goods you found in the West. But that shoddy consumer good compared to the lovely consumer good was in fact a price you had to pay for full employment. And this is something which actually Gandhiji wrote. There is a correspondence, wonderful correspondence. I would very seriously urge all students of economics and development studies to look at the Gandhi-Tagore correspondence. Nothing better has been written on problems of development than what is written in that correspondence. Tagore says that, look, why are you talking about, what is, you remember cloths, imported cloth used to be burned. So Tagore says, how come, why are you talking about burning cloth in a country in which people don't have enough clothes to clothe themselves? How can you burn cloth? So Gandhi actually said that, look, that's a symbolic gesture, and it's a symbolic gesture because if I drape myself in the finery imported from Savile Row or Bond Street in London, as a result of that, my brother the weaver is going without his food. As a result, for me, it is better to buy his clothes, whatever he has woven, even though it may be of inferior quality, compared to what is imported from Savile Row or Bond Street or whatever. Therefore, a degree of control on technological cum structural change would have to be introduced if we are going to overcome the problem of labor reserves. Now, this, I know, goes against quite a lot of left thinking. So the last point I want to make is actually to contrast what I'm saying with what theoretically left thinking says. Left thinking theoretically says that, look, you don't really need to control technological change. You don't need to control structural change. Let there be as rapid technological come structural change as possible. But within a world in which, let us say in a socialist country, what do you have? You suppose labor productivity doubles. Everybody then can get the same wage as before but work half the time. Therefore, if you have an increase in labor productivity, the increase in labor productivity in an economy which has a work-sharing, product-sharing ethic would not mean any unemployment. Therefore, the traditional left thinking would say, and this certainly perfectly valid, that we ought to introduce a work-sharing, product-sharing ethic rather than controls on technological come structural change. However, it seems to me that it will be far more difficult, given the position where we are, to actually introduce a work-sharing, product-sharing ethic, because that takes a much longer period, a development of consciousness that is far more advanced than we can hope for in the foreseeable future among the working people, than introducing constraints on technological come structural change. All these ideas which I've suggested, namely, number one, protection of the petty production sector, number two, protection of the petty production sector and introduction of cooperative and collective, voluntarily collective forms of property and so on. Secondly, the idea that there has to be land augmentation through activities of the state, and thirdly, some degree of control on the pace of technological and structural change. All these are totally diametrically opposed to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism basically says that open the economy to free trade. If there is a fluctuation in world market prices, that fluctuation would visit upon our traditional peasants, even if they get indebted and so on, it doesn't matter because free trade is very important. What I'm suggesting by protection and promotion of petty production is, of course, controls so that the peasantry gets a profit, continues to have a remunerative set of prices independent of world market conditions, which basically means, abrogation of free trade affecting peasants' lives. When I talk about land augmentation, what I mean is an active involvement of the state in promoting the petty production sector, agriculture, fishermen, and so on and so forth. And that implies state activism, which neoliberalism is opposed to, because it favors state activism only in favor of the big capitalists. And when I'm talking about control and technological come structural change, that is again something which is completely anathema as far as neoliberalism is concerned, that actually wants to do away with all kinds of controls. It seems to me, therefore, that the pursuit of neoliberal development strategy would continue to produce in our country growth supposedly at one pole together with growing poverty at another, and there's plenty of evidence to show that poverty, certainly in the sense of malnutrition, inadequate food, has been increasing in our country. I will give you one statistic. Take the number of people, in our country the poverty norm is 2,100 calories per person per day in urban India, 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India. The number of people who are below 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India was 58% of the total rural population in 1993-4, just around the beginning of neoliberal policies, and I take that here because it was an NSS large samples every year. The proportion of people who are below that calorie norm in 2011-12 is 68%. Therefore, you actually find that by the standard nutritional norms defining poverty, there has been an increase. In urban India, taking the same 2,100 calorie norm, the proportion of 57 and 65. So food deprivation, which is the most elemental aspect of poverty, has been increasing. In the course of discussions, I would like to explain how this is compatible at all with the poverty measures that the Planning Commission and so on have, which show that poverty is declining. So if we are to avoid that kind of a development, which is no development, no concept of development can possibly qualify as a concept of development if it calls the growth of poverty at one pole and of income at another development. Then we would have to have a break away from the neoliberal paradigm, initially in the directions that I'm talking about. And obviously, such a break away from these directions has political dimensions which I did not spell out. Now, obviously, parties, political formations, which are bourgeois political formations, which are basically beholden to big business, are not going to introduce that kind of a breakaway. It would require a worker-peasant alliance. It would require political forces which are favorable to, can understand and appreciate and lead a worker-peasant alliance to introduce this alternative trajectory of development. Thank you.